They sent her to die in the dark. What they didn't know was that the dark had already sent someone to find her. King Caelan had not slept. He had been seated at the war table in Ashenmoor's inner hall since the third bell of midnight, when the palace guard reported, with the particular quietness of men delivering news they do not want to deliver, that the boy was gone. Not taken. Gone. Ren's chamber window was unlatched. His bed was cold. And his boots, the small worn pair that sat beside the door every night, were missing. Caelan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In 11 years on the Lycan throne, no border dispute had survived his composure. No challenger had outlasted his patience. His enforcers understood the difference between the king who spoke loudly and the king who went quiet, and this was the quiet that meant something was about to end. 20 warriors, he said. Full formation. Border sweep. Eastern edge. Now. They moved within minutes. 20 Lycan enforcers in dark armor, each carrying the particular stillness of fighters who had never had to explain themselves after a hunt. They spread through the trees in disciplined silence, tracking the boy's scent through undergrowth and cold air, weapons ready for whatever had drawn a 9-year-old child out of a fortified palace into the most dangerous stretch of unclaimed land on the continent. Caelan moved ahead of them. He was faster when he chose to be, and tonight he chose to be. The scent trail led him to the eastern clearing, a wide natural break in the ancient forest where the tree line pulled back and the ground opened into a patch of wildflowers that had no business being so alive in the cold. He stopped at the clearing's edge. He had expected a threat. He had come prepared for a threat. He had 20 armed warriors, 30 seconds behind him, and 11 years of decisions that had never once been wrong. What he found was a girl. She was sitting against the base of the largest oak at the clearing's far edge, her back straight despite everything, despite the torn dress, the blood dried along her temple and collarbone, the eye that had swollen half shut from a blow that had been delivered before she ever reached this forest. She was clearly injured. She was clearly exhausted. And she had clearly, deliberately, kept herself upright through all of it. Across her lap, deeply, peacefully asleep, was Ren. The boy's cheek rested against her arm. His face was slack and unguarded in a way Caelan had not seen in 4 months, not since the night they found him in the woods, with no name and no memory, and a terror behind his eyes that no palace healer had been able to reach. The 20 warriors arrived at the clearing's edge and stopped, weapons raised. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The girl's eyes opened. Dark, steady, and completely without fear. She did not reach for the boy as a shield. She did not flinch at the drawn blades. She simply looked at Caelan the way someone looks at a problem they have already calculated and waited. He walked toward her slowly. She tracked every step but held still. He knelt, not to examine the boy, not to assess the threat. He knelt in the wildflowers at the base of that ancient oak, in full armor, in front of 20 of his soldiers, and he looked at the burn mark on her collarbone, the brand that was not a pack mark, though he did not know that yet, and he asked her the only question that came. Who did this to you? She could not answer. She would not be able to answer for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with what had been done to her long before tonight. But she held his gaze and reached up and pressed 2 fingers to the mark on her collarbone, and the look in her eyes told him enough. She kept him warm, he thought. All night, injured and alone, she kept him warm. He stood. He unclasped his outer cloak heavy, fur-lined, the kind built for a king in a cold forest, and settled it around her shoulders. She went very still, as if she had never had something placed over her that wasn't a burden. Can you walk? She nodded. Then walk with us. And that was how it began. Not with rescue, not with mercy. With a man who looked at a woman the world had filed under worthless, and recognized something the world had been too careless to notice. But to understand what she carried into that clearing, and why Marin had spent 15 years making certain she would never leave it alive, we have to go back. Back to Ironvale. Back to the pack that built its hierarchy on the silence of the one person it could never afford to let speak. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit subscribe right now. Stories like this drop every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Caelan had not slept in 19 hours. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the feeling sitting in his chest as he moved through the eastern forest. Something that 11 years on the lichen throne had trained nearly out of him. Something close to fear, not for himself. Never for himself. For a 9-year-old boy in palace clothes, who had no business being anywhere near this border, and who had been missing since the third bell of midnight, he moved ahead of his enforcers. He was faster than all of them when the situation required it, and this situation required it. 20 warriors spread through the trees behind him in search formation, disciplined, silent, trained for exactly this kind of retrieval. They had weapons drawn. They had orders. Find the boy, neutralize the threat, ask questions after. Caelan tracked Ren's scent himself. It was faint hours old, diluted by cold air and wet ground, but it was there, threading east through the undergrowth like a question he was following to its answer. The tree line thinned. The forest opened, and Caelan stopped. There was a clearing ahead, wide, unexpected, the kind of natural break in ancient woodland that looks almost deliberate. Wildflowers grew in patches across the ground despite the cold, yellow and purple against the dark soil. Morning light had just begun pressing through the canopy above, arriving in long pale shafts that hadn't fully committed to dawn yet. At the far edge of the clearing, at the base of the largest oak he had ever seen, sat a girl. She was young, early 20s at most, dark hair loose and tangled around her face, an earth-colored dress torn at the shoulder and hemline, stained dark with blood that had dried hours ago. One eye was swollen nearly shut. Across her collarbone, visible through the torn neckline of her dress, was a burn mark, circular, deliberate, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. She was upright, spine straight against the bark of the oak, and across her lap, curled on his side with one small hand resting open on her arm, was Ren. The boy's face was completely relaxed, slack and unguarded and peaceful in a way Caelan had not seen since the night they found him in these same woods 4 months ago, before the nightmares started, before the silence settled in, before every palace healer ran out of explanations. Ren looked, in this moment, like a child who had simply decided he was safe and gone to sleep without argument. The 20 warriors arrived at the clearing's edge behind Caelan, weapons raised, eyes trained on the girl. 20 men who had never once hesitated at a border encounter, standing completely still. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because the threat they had come to neutralize was sitting in wildflowers with a sleeping child in her lap and both arms curved around him, not as a hostage, not as leverage, just the way you hold something you decided to protect and meant it. Caelan walked forward, slowly, deliberately. The girl watched him come. She did not shrink. She did not shift Ren's position, or use him as a shield, or do any of the 10 calculated things a person in her position might have done. She simply tracked Caelan's approach with dark, steady eyes, and kept her arm exactly where it was. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her injuries. He looked at the burn mark. He looked at Ren's face, still peaceful, still unguarded, and something moved through him that he didn't have an immediate name for. He knelt, not to examine the boy, not to check for threats. He brought himself down to her level, and he looked at her directly, and he asked the only question that arrived. Who did this to you? She couldn't answer. He didn't know that yet, didn't know the full weight of what that silence meant. But she held his gaze without flinching, and slowly raised her free hand and pressed 2 fingers to the burn mark on her collarbone. Her eyes didn't move from his face. He read her, the way you read something that has been saying the same thing for years to people who weren't listening. The temperature around him dropped several degrees. Behind him, the enforcer captain stepped forward and began citing the protocol Omega found at the border. No pack identification confirmed. Standard procedure requires processing before Caelan raised one hand. The captain stopped mid-word. Caelan stood. He looked at nothing in particular when he spoke, but every warrior in the clearing heard it. She kept him warm. All night, injured, alone, she kept him warm. He unclasped his outer cloak, heavy, fur-lined, built for a king in a cold forest, and draped it across her shoulders. She went absolutely still, the way someone goes still when they receive something they have no frame of reference for. Can you walk? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Then walk with us. She had expected 20 different things from the moment the warriors appeared through the trees. She had run through the possibilities, the way she ran through everything quickly, precisely, without sentiment. None of the 20 things had included this. She hadn't expected him. And as she followed the Lichen King out of that clearing at dawn, Ren's small hand wrapped around 3 of her fingers. She understood with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 22 years reading rooms she was never supposed to be in. That something had just begun that Maren had not planned for. The room they gave her was small. Plain walls, a single window, a bed with clean linens that smelled like cedar and something faintly floral. The palace healer had worked on her wounds in careful silence, stitching, wrapping, asking nothing, and had left a tray of food on the small table by the door before quietly closing it behind her. Selah had not touched the food. She was at the window. 3 floors below, the training courtyard was alive with movement. Lichen enforcers running drills in pairs, their footwork precise and deliberate. She watched the way the younger ones glanced toward the senior trainer before committing to each move, seeking permission without asking for it. She watched which guards rotated at the eastern corridor entrance, and how long before the next one came. She noted the single blind spot near the far gate, where 2 patrol paths crossed without overlap. Old habit. She had been doing it since she was old enough to understand that knowing a room was the only advantage she was ever going to have. The courtyard's smell iron and sweat and cold stone was close enough to Ironvale's training grounds that the memory arrived before she could stop it. Ironvale's hierarchy was not complicated. It was simply merciless. At the top, the alpha bloodlines. Below them, the ranked wolves in descending order of strength, lineage, and utility. And at the very bottom, the omegas. Assigned, not evaluated, placed, not positioned. Selah had been placed at the bottom when she was 4 years old. Not because she had been tested and found lacking. She had never been tested. Maren had looked at her, a small, silent child standing in the assembly hall with no parents to speak for her, and made a determination in the time it takes to close a ledger. Omega. Outer settlement. Labor assignment to follow, when she was old enough to carry weight. It was never revisited. She remembered the brand. Not clearly. The mind protects you from the things that would break you if you held them fully, but in fragments. The smell. Mostly. And Maren's face. That was the part that had stayed with her longest. Because Maren had not looked cruel. She had not looked satisfied, or angry, or even particularly interested. She had looked the way a person looks when they are completing a task they have done before. Efficient, unhurried. The brand was explained to Selah as a pack identification mark, standard for omegas of her rank. She had believed it. She was 4 years old. She had no reason not to. The silence came before the brand. That was the thing she could never fully reach. The memory lived at the very edge of her, behind a door she had never been able to open. She knew there had been a sound, once, something she had almost made, a voice beginning, and then nothing. Not gradually. Suddenly. The way a candle goes out when someone cups their hand around it. She had grown up believing she was born this way. Everyone in Ironvale had believed it too. It was easier that way. Easier to dismiss what you have already categorized. Easier to speak over someone you have decided produces no sound worth hearing. That was the thing about being invisible. They talked around her constantly in the outer settlement, in the storage rooms, in the corridors of the main hall, where she delivered provisions and cleared refuse and repaired things that higher-ranked wolves didn't want to spend effort on. They never lowered their voices. They never paused. She was furniture. She was weather. She was simply there, generating no signal worth adjusting for. She had learned to use it. If they didn't account for her, she could be anywhere. She could know everything. She could map the architecture of every room she was not supposed to understand, and file it, and keep it, and wait. The knock at her door was precise, 2 measured knocks, the kind that announces authority without requiring it. She turned from the window. The woman who entered was sharp-featured and composed, dressed in Ashenmoor's deep blue court colors, carrying nothing in her hands, which meant she had already decided she wouldn't need anything she'd brought. She introduced herself as Nev, senior advisor to the king. 11 years in his service, though she did not say that part. Selah read it in the way she held the doorframe, like someone who had long since stopped needing to prove she belonged in any room she entered. Nev spoke clearly and without warmth, which Selah respected more than warmth would have been. She said the king had arranged for Selah to remain in the palace while her situation was formally evaluated. She said it would take a few days. She said Selah was not a prisoner. Selah watched her face while she talked. She read 3 things Neve did not say aloud: that she had reservations, that she had already begun asking questions about the brand, and that she was not yet certain whether Selah was a problem to be managed or something else entirely. Neve left without asking why Selah was still at the window an hour later, still watching the courtyard, still counting. She would not have understood the answer. Selah was not watching because she was afraid. She was watching because she had spent 22 years learning that the people who underestimate you only do it once, and she intended to know exactly where everyone in this palace stood before that moment arrived. He found her on the second morning. Selah was at her window. She was always at her window, when the door opened without a knock, and Wren walked in wearing his palace clothes, and an expression that suggested he had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. He crossed the room, climbed into the chair beside hers, and looked out the window with her. That was all. He simply sat. She glanced at him sideways. He glanced back. Neither of them moved. After a while, she pointed at the training courtyard below, at a guard who had been walking the same patrol path for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. She raised an eyebrow at Wren. He studied the guard, then held up 3 fingers. She nodded, and something in his expression shifted into something that was almost a smile. That was how it started. The palace healers had been working with Wren for 4 months. They had tried structured therapy and gentle questioning, and giving him space, and filling the space, and every measured approach a trained healer could think of. He had not spoken once. Not a syllable. Not a sound. He had been found in lichen territory on a cold morning, with no memory of his name, no explanation for how he had gotten there, and a fear behind his eyes that the healers described in their notes as foundational, as if the terror had been built into him from a place they could not reach. The nightmares came every night. The guards outside his room had learned not to startle at the sounds he made in his sleep. What Selah and Wren built between them had no formal name. It was not sign language, it was more specific than that, more private. A raised chin meant look at that. 2 fingers pressed together meant I already know. A slow blink meant I believe you. He had started adding to it from his side, a tap on the table when he agreed, a small precise shake of his head when he didn't. A pointing gesture she had learned meant explain that more. He carried a small notebook. He could read and write that had surprised the healers. The fact that his literacy was intact while his speech was gone. He used it sparingly, in short phrases, as if words on paper were a currency he was careful with. On the 3rd day he wrote, "Do you get tired of quiet?" She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. Then she shook her head. He wrote, "Me neither." Then, after a pause, "Mostly." She understood the mostly. She had understood it her entire life. It was on that same afternoon that he showed her the drawing. He pulled it from the back of his notebook, folded carefully, the fold lines worn soft from being opened and closed many times. He smoothed it flat on the table between them and looked at her. It was a woman, older than Selah, dark-haired, standing in front of a small house with a low fence and a tree beside the door. The drawing was detailed in the way that only memory can be detailed, not artistically precise, but emotionally precise. The angle of the woman's shoulders, the specific way her hair fell. Wren wrote beneath it, "From a dream. I don't know who she is." Selah looked at the drawing for a long time. She looked at the woman's shoulders, at the tree beside the door, at the low fence she had sat on as a very small child, while someone with dark hair stood in the doorway and watched to make sure she didn't fall. She kept her face still. She had spent 22 years keeping her face still in rooms where her reactions could be used against her. She folded the drawing gently and handed it back to him. She held up one finger, "Keep that," and he nodded and tucked it back into his notebook, like it was the most important thing he owned. She did not let herself think about what it meant. Not yet. She did not hear Caelan arrive. She became aware of him gradually, the specific quality of stillness in the corridor outside her open door that was different from the usual palace quiet. She looked up. He was sitting on the floor of the corridor, back against the opposite wall, watching them with an expression she did not have a word for yet. He had clearly been there for some time. He did not look embarrassed about it. She met his eyes, then looked back at Wren, who had fallen asleep in the chair without meaning to, his head tipped sideways, his notebook still in his hand. Caelan stayed another 20 minutes. Then he stood, quietly, and left. He returned near midnight, when the corridor was dark and the palace had gone to its particular nighttime silence. He leaned in the doorframe and looked at Ren sleeping, still quiet, no sounds from the room that shouldn't be there. "First time," he said. The words were barely above a breath. She nodded. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he left. She watched the space where he had been standing for longer than she meant to. She did not know yet what the drawing meant. She was not ready to know. But she had folded it carefully in her mind and kept it, because 22 years of reading rooms that weren't meant for her had taught her one thing above all others. The details that people carry without understanding why are always the most important ones. The document arrived on the 4th morning. Caelan was already in the council chamber when the courier came sealed envelope, Ironvale's mark pressed deep into dark wax, addressed formally to the Lycan High Council. He read it standing. He read it twice. Then, he set it on the table with the particular care of a man who does not want the object in his hands anymore. Nev read it over his shoulder. Her expression did not break it, never fully broke, but something shifted just around her eyes, a tightening. The look of someone whose suspicion has just been confirmed before they were ready to act on it. The petition cited the ancient border compact. Simple, clean, and precise, any Omega found packless within the Ashenmoor border corridor could be formally reclaimed by her originating alpha within 7 days of documented discovery. The reclamation window had been filed on day 1, within hours of Sayla's arrival, before most of the palace had even been told she was here. Neve noted that quietly to herself and said nothing aloud. She did not have evidence yet. She had the timing, and the timing was too clean, and those were two different things in a council chamber. Mirren herself arrived before midday. She came with a small delegation, 4 members of Ironvale's formal council, all dressed in the settlement's deep gray colors, all carrying the practiced composure of people who had done this before. And Mirren walked at their center, unhurried, immaculate, her dark hair pinned back with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was its own argument. She did not look like a woman who left people at borders to die in the dark. That was exactly the point. Sayla saw her from the upper corridor. She had been moving between the east wing and the healer's room when the doors to the great hall opened below and Mirren's delegation entered. She stopped. She did not step back from the railing. She did not flinch or reach for anything or allow a single visible reaction to cross her face. She simply went still, the specific, practiced stillness she had developed over 22 years of being in rooms where her reactions could be read against her. She watched Mirren greet the council members assembled in the hall below, watched the handshakes, the slight inclines of the head, the careful choreography of formal courtesy. And then in the space between one greeting and the next, she watched one council member smile, just briefly, just slightly. Before Mirren had said anything that warranted a smile, Sayla filed it. She did not look away for another 3 minutes. Mirren requested a private audience with the king. Caelan granted it with Neve present, which was not a concession. It was a signal to Neve that he wanted a second set of eyes in the room. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Afterward, Neve's account to Caelan was precise and brief. Mirren had been gracious, concerned. She had described Sayla as a deeply troubled Omega who had been deteriorating for some time, a danger primarily to herself, someone the pack had been struggling to keep safe. She had expressed genuine-sounding gratitude to the king for finding her before something worse had happened. She had invoked the treaty with the soft regret of someone who wished the law allowed her more flexibility. She had been, Neve said, completely convincing. Caelan told Neve to find a legal counter. Neve said she would try. She did not yet tell him what she actually thought, that the filing date meant someone inside the palace had sent word to Ironvale within hours of Sayla's arrival. That the smile had happened before it should have. That this had the architecture of something built over time, rather than assembled in 4 days. She did not say any of that yet, because she had no evidence. Only pattern recognition. And pattern recognition, in a council chamber, meant nothing without something to anchor it. That evening, Caelan came to Sayla's room. He had not decided what to tell her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, working through the options, and then looked at her face and understood that the decision had already been made for him. She was watching him from the chair by the window. She had read it on Neve's face at dinner, on the altered rhythm of the palace's afternoon, on something in the way the guards had repositioned near the east entrance. She had spent 4 days mapping this place. She knew what a shift in weather looked like here. She held up 6 fingers, then closed her hand into a fist. He stared at her. She stared back. "I'm going to find a way," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Not relieved, not reassured. Just acknowledging the way you acknowledge a statement you've already prepared to operate without. She had spent 22 years not counting on anyone to find a way. She was already counting on herself. Marin had built the petition perfectly. She had 17 years of practice at this. What she did not know, what she had never had reason to account for, was that the woman she considered a silenced variable had spent 6 days inside a lichen palace reading every face in every room, and had already identified 3 of Marin's pieces on the board before Marin had finished setting them. Nev did not sleep on the 5th night. She had been at her desk since the midnight bell, working through the treaty archive the way she worked through everything methodically, without assumption, pulling each thread individually before drawing any conclusions about the pattern. The petition's legal citations were accurate. That was the first thing she confirmed. Marin knew the border compact precisely every clause correctly numbered, every condition properly cited. That kind of precision did not come from a lawyer consulted in a hurry. It came from preparation. From someone who had been ready to file this document long before there was anything to file it about. Then she went to the courier logs. The petition had been filed on day 1. That fact alone was notable. But the courier logs showed something more specific. The dispatch from Ironvale had originated before the official palace record of Sayla's arrival had been entered, which meant whoever sent word to Marin had done so within 6 hours of Sayla crossing the border, before the documentation, before the healer's report, before most of the palace knew there was anything to know. Someone inside Ashenmoor had been watching for her. Neve moved to the gate records, then to the internal correspondence archive, 7 years of it, stored in the lower records hall in bound volumes that nobody had touched in long enough that the dust was its own kind of evidence. She was not looking for a single document. She was looking for a shape. She found it on the 5th day, in the 3rd volume. 3 council members. 7 years of border policy votes. Every vote that had weakened Ashenmoor's Eastern Patrol presence, delayed the border compact review, or reduced the enforcement budget for the unclaimed corridor cast the same way, every time, by the same 3 men. Individually, each vote had a reasonable justification. Collectively, over 7 years, the pattern had no innocent explanation. She brought it to Caelan at midnight, set it on his desk without preamble, and stood back. He read it without speaking. When he looked up, his expression was controlled. It was always controlled, but his jaw had shifted in the way it shifted when something had reached past the composure. How long? 7 years minimum, she told him. Possibly longer. The paper trail only went back 7 years because that was as far as she had reached before she came to him. He was at Sayla's door within 10 minutes. She was awake. She was always awake at this hour. She slept in short intervals and lightly, the habit of someone who had spent years in a place where sleeping deeply was a vulnerability. She was sitting at the small table with a candle, and she looked at him when he entered with the particular steadiness of someone who had already prepared for bad news. He sat across from her and told her what Neve found. All of it. The filing date, the courier logs, the 7 years of votes. He spoke quietly and without softening any of it, because he had already understood that she did not need information softened. She listened without surprise. When he finished, she reached for the pen and the paper she kept on the nightstand. She wrote 4 words and turned the page toward him. "I know which 3. He read the names. The first 2 matched Neve's list exactly. The 3rd was a name Neve had not yet reached in the archive. He stared at the paper, then at her. "How?" She set the pen down and tapped her temple once. Then she pointed toward the corridor toward the great hall, the dining room, every space in the palace where the past 4 days had played out in full view of a woman everyone had forgotten to account for. She had watched them. Every meal, every corridor passing, every moment Marin was in proximity to a council member and something moved in their face or hands that they did not know they were doing. 22 years of reading rooms. This one had taken 4 days. Day 6 arrived, and the walls of the situation closed in from every side. Neve's evidence was real but circumstantial. A pattern of votes and a filing date were not enough to formally challenge a council ruling without a confession or a physical link tying the correspondence directly to Ironvale. The 3 compromised members blocked every counterpetition avenue Caelan and Neve attempted. Each legal move met a closed door. By evening, there were no moves left. Selah was at the table when Ren found her. She had not heard him come in. She had been sitting with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance and the pen in front of her, but no paper, because she had not yet found the words for what she was going to have to do alone in the pen in time. Morning. Ren climbed into the chair beside her without asking. He put his small hand over hers. She looked at him. He reached into his pocket and placed the drawing on the table between them. The dark-haired woman, the small house, the low fence. He smoothed it flat with his palm. Then he pointed at the woman in the drawing. Then at Selah. She had 1 day left. One morning to find a move that 3 council members and a 15-year conspiracy had spent years making sure did not exist. She looked at the drawing, the woman neither of them could name yet, the house neither of them remembered, and something crystallized in her chest that was not quite courage and not quite rage. It was older than both. It was the specific resolution of someone who has been told their whole life that they have nothing, deciding that nothing is actually something, if you know how to use it. The council chamber faced east. Selah had noticed that on her second day inside the palace, the way the morning light came through the high windows and laid itself across the stone floor in long gold strips. She had thought it was beautiful then. Standing outside the closed chamber doors on the 7th morning, she thought it was fitting. Some things deserved to end in full light. She could hear the proceedings through the wood, the formal reader's voice, flat and precise, working through Marin's petition clause by clause. She had memorized every word of that petition 3 days ago. She knew exactly where they were. She knew exactly how much time remained. She was still wearing the torn dress. The palace attendants had come to her room at first light with clean clothes, soft gray wool, ashen-moor colors, neatly folded. She had looked at them for a long moment and then set them aside. She wanted to walk into that room looking exactly like what Marin had left at the border. Torn, bloodied at the collar, marked. She wanted every elder in that chamber to see it clearly before she showed them what was underneath. Inside the room, she could hear Caelan's voice low, controlled, making the last legal objection available to him, challenging the validity of a vote where 3 council members held a documented conflict of interest. She heard the counter-motion. She heard the ruling. 3-2. A silence. Then Nev's voice, very quiet, saying nothing. 30 seconds. Selah pushed the doors open and walked in. The room turned. All of it, every elder, every delegate, every armored guard along the walls. Caelan's eyes found her immediately from the head of the chamber. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. Something closer to recognition. Marin turned last. And for one fraction of a moment, one small, unguarded instant, something shifted behind her eyes. The first crack in 15 years of perfect composure. Then it closed. Her expression settled back into its practiced patience, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her, and she waited. Selah walked to the center of the chamber floor and stopped. She reached up to her collarbone. The brand had been there since she was 4 years old. She had been told it was a pack identification mark. She had believed it because she was 4 years old and had no framework for the truth that it was a suppression seal, physically tied to her bloodline mark and her voice, designed by someone who understood exactly what she was and needed the world to never find out. The palace healer had spent 2 nights explaining the dissolution. It could not be broken from outside. It could not be removed by force or by another's hand. It required her. Her willingness, her intention, her choice. Only she could do it. She pressed her fingers to it and pulled. The pain was clean and immediate. Her face went white. Her eyes filled not with tears, just the body's automatic answer to something being separated from it. She did not make a sound. She had never made a sound in her life. This was no different. The brand split, peeled back. And beneath it, rising gold against her skin like something that had been waiting a long time to breathe, was the bloodline mark. 2 elders stood up from their seats. One of the 3 compromised council members took a single step backward, as if distance would help him. The gold mark spread from her collarbone upward, tracing the line of her throat, unmistakable to every person in that room who had been taught what it meant. Every lichen elder in Ashenmoor grew up knowing that mark, not from history, from warning. It predated every pack charter, every territorial treaty, every throne currently occupied in the region, including the one at the head of this very chamber. Merrin went still, completely, entirely still. The stillness of someone watching 15 years of careful construction come apart at the foundation. And then the suppression seal on Selah's voice tied to the bloodline mark, since the night Merrin applied it, dissolved with it. Selah exhaled. One breath, slow, like a door opening that had been sealed shut for longer than she could remember. A second breath. She did not look at Merrin. She did not look at the council. She turned toward the chamber doorway where Ren stood, because of course he had followed her. He was 9 years old, and she had told him to stay in his room, and he had lasted approximately 4 minutes before deciding that was not something he was willing to do. He was frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, something working in his face that he had no words for yet. She said his name, his real name, the one that had been locked somewhere beneath both their silences until this moment cracked it open. The boy crossed the chamber in 4 seconds, and she caught him, and the room was absolutely silent. Caelan looked at Neve. Neve looked at the bloodline mark. Then she looked at the 3 council members still standing, and she spoke in the voice she reserved for moments when the outcome was already decided, and everyone simply needed to be informed of it. You cannot legally reclaim a bloodline heir under the Border Omega statute. The petition is void. A pause. And I have 7 years of your correspondence with Ironvale that we will be discussing in a separate proceeding, at length, beginning today. Merrin was escorted from the chamber before she spoke another word. 22 years of silence. And the first word she chose, the first sound she gave to the world, was not her own name. It was his. Because that had always been who she was, even when no one could hear it. The council chamber did not empty loudly. That was the thing about a room full of powerful people. When the ground shifts beneath them, they leave quietly, carefully, like men who have just remembered they have somewhere else to be. Neve did not leave. She stood at the front of the chamber with 3 sets of correspondence in her hands, and a patience in her eyes that had been building for 7 years, and she addressed the compromised council members, the way she addressed every problem she had already solved, without raising her voice, without hurrying, and without leaving them any impression that what happened next was negotiable. Merrin was escorted out before the second proceeding began. She walked the way she had walked into the palace 4 days ago, straight-backed, unhurried, composed. But her eyes, just once, moved to the doorway where Selah had stood. Then she looked away. That was all. 15 years of careful architecture, and that was all she gave it. Selah did not watch her go. She was already in the corridor. She had made it perhaps 40 steps from the chamber doors, before Ren's legs simply stopped working the way legs do when a 9-year-old has burned through every reserve he possesses, and the body decides the matter without consulting anyone. He sat down against the corridor wall, his head finding her shoulder, and he was asleep before she could suggest they find somewhere more suitable. So she sat too. On the stone floor of the palace corridor, in the torn dress she had worn deliberately that morning, with the boy's weight warm against her side, and the bloodline mark still faintly gold at her throat. She did not try to move him. She folded her hands in her lap, and she breathed, slowly, the way you breathe when you have been holding something for a very long time, and you are only just beginning to understand that you can put it down. She heard Caelan before she saw him. His footsteps were unhurried. He came around the corridor's bend, took in the scene in a single look, and without a word, without any visible deliberation, he sat down on the floor beside her. King, crown, 11 years of authority that had never once bent to inconvenience. On the corridor floor, he did not explain it, and she did not ask him to. For a while neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of 2 people who had each spent considerable time in quiet, and had learned to tell the difference between the kind that empties you and the kind that holds you. At the corridor's far end, Neve appeared. She stopped. She looked at them, the king on the stone floor, the girl beside him, the sleeping boy between them, and something shifted in her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief. It was the look of someone who has been running calculations for days and has just received the final number. She turned and walked the other direction without a word. Selah spoke first. Her voice was rough at the edges, slightly slower than she intended. 22 years without practice will do that, and she was learning the architecture of it in real time, building each word carefully, the way you build something you have never built before, but somehow already know the shape of. He needs to remember more, she said, before I tell him everything. Caelan did not ask what she meant. He looked at Ren's sleeping face and then back at her, and she understood that he had already been piecing it together, the drawing, the timing, to the specific way the boy had crossed that chamber in 4 seconds. Like his body knew something. His mind was still reaching for. The woman in the drawing, Caelan said quietly. Not a question. She nodded. There was more behind it than she had words for yet. What she suspected about their mother, what it meant that Marin had needed them separated. Why the suppression had to be so complete, so early, so permanent. That was a conversation for another day, when Ren had more of himself back, and she had more of her voice. We'll go slowly, Caelan said. Though we sat in the corridor air between them, and neither of them reached for it, and neither of them moved away from it, it was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Later, Ren woke in his own bed. Someone had carried him there while he slept, and he had not stirred, because that was what genuine safety did to a body that had been running on fear for 4 months. On the nightstand beside him was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven. The letters formed with the particular deliberateness of someone learning to mean what they write. I am 3 doors down. I am not going anywhere. He read it once. He read it again. Then he folded it carefully and placed it beneath his pillow, next to the drawing of the woman neither of them could name yet. 3 doors down. For the first time in 22 years, she had somewhere to be that was not the edge of somewhere else. Not the outer boundary of a settlement that tolerated her. Not the lowest rung of a hierarchy that had decided her worth before she was old enough to question it. Not the border in the dark with the cold coming in and no one looking back. 3 doors down from a boy who had been searching for her without knowing her name, in a palace that had no category for her until she walked into its council chamber and made one. She sat at her window and listened to the sounds of a place that was not yet home, but was becoming one. And she thought for the first time, in a voice that was entirely her own, that becoming was enough. For now, becoming was everything. 3 months is not a long time. Unless you have spent 22 years in the same place, in the same silence, assigned the same worth by the same people who never once looked directly at you. In that case, 3 months can be a different lifetime entirely. Sayla's handwriting on the palace records was steady now, deliberate, precise, each letter formed with the confidence of someone who had decided that if she was going to do something, she was going to do it completely. The palace tutor had told Neve at the end of the 2nd week that his student did not need instruction. She needed harder problems. Neve had not looked surprised. She had simply sourced harder problems. The bloodline documentation sat in 3 copies across 3 territories. What it meant in legal terms was still being argued. The bloodline predated the frameworks that governed current territorial law. And there was no precedent for it, because the last heir before Sayla had disappeared before any of the current structures existed. Neve was drafting the protocol herself. She had asked Sayla's input on every clause. This was not something Neve did with anyone, and everyone in the palace who understood how Neve worked understood exactly what it meant. The 3 compromised council members had been removed and formally prosecuted. Marin was under cross-territory sanction, stripped of alpha authority across 3 territories. Her movements monitored, her correspondences reviewed. The review would take years. Neve had noted this, with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who had been building toward a specific outcome for longer than she had admitted, even to herself. Ren's memories came back the way the light came back in the morning, not all at once, but steadily, incrementally, 1 degree at a time. A smell would do it sometimes, a sound. Once, a particular quality of afternoon light through the eastern window that made him stop walking mid-corridor and stand very still for a long moment, before his face settled into something that was not quite recognition, but was moving toward it. Sayla was nearby each time. She did not push, she did not prompt. She simply stayed close enough that when the pieces arrived, he had somewhere to bring them. In the training courtyard on a cool mid-morning, she moved through the sparring sequence with the focused economy of someone who had spent 22 years reading bodies before they acted. Her opponent was faster and heavier, and had been training since before she arrived. She read him 2 moves ahead and waited. And when the window opened, she used it cleanly. And the match was over before most people watching had registered what shifted. She looked up toward the courtyard's edge. Caelan was already looking. He had been watching for longer than she had noticed. Arms folded, expression carrying that particular quality his face held when he was paying close attention to something he did not intend to look away from. She held his gaze for a moment. He said nothing. She said nothing. Neither of them needed to. Some things had been accumulating between them for 3 months, in exactly the way that felt right. Slowly, without pressure, without either of them rushing the other toward a destination before they were ready to name it. At dinner that evening, the table held 4. Neve on one side, efficient and composed even over food. Caelan at the head, quieter than usual in the way he sometimes was after a long day of decisions. Ren beside Sela, working his way through his plate with the focused seriousness of a 9-year-old who had decided eating was also a task worth doing properly. He looked up at Sela midway through the meal. He had been doing this more, choosing words deliberately, testing them in his mouth before releasing them, the way she had once tested each letter of her handwriting. He said something to her. 4 words, quiet, delivered with perfect timing, about the specific expression on Neve's face when the tutor's latest report had arrived that morning. It was exactly right. It landed exactly where he intended it to. Sela laughed. It was not a polished sound. It was genuine, slightly surprised. The laugh of someone who had not done it enough to have made it smooth yet. It filled the corner of the room before she could think about it. Caelan looked up from his plate. Neve set her cup down. The table went still for a moment, the particular stillness of people who are afraid that if they move, something rare will stop. Then Ren smiled, satisfied, and went back to his dinner, and the moment passed into the ordinary texture of the evening, which was exactly where it belonged. Late that night she stood at her window. The palace grounds below, the Ashenmoor forest beyond the outer walls, and in the distance, just visible against the tree line, the eastern clearing where the ancient oak stood. She spoke aloud, quietly, to no one, just because she could. She said, "Ren's name the way you say something you waited a long time to be able to say slowly, with full attention, like you are still getting used to the weight of it in your mouth, and you do not want to miss a single part of it." She looked at the clearing and she did not see the night they left her there. She saw the wildflowers. She saw the beginning. They had left her with nothing, no voice, no rank, no name that anyone would speak. They had not known, when they walked away without looking back, that nothing was the one thing she knew exactly how to build from. She had been doing it her entire life. She was only just getting started. If Sela's story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And drop a comment below what was the moment that got you.